Somewhere in the English countryside, Warner Brothers is reportedly spending more money on a single episode of television than most Hollywood blockbusters cost to make from start to finish. We're talking about a number so large that if the reports are accurate, 1 hour of this show will have cost more than the entire original Home Alone, Pulp Fiction, and the Blair Witch Project combined several times over. And by the time you finish this video, you'll understand exactly how television went from the cheap, disposable medium your grandparents grew up with to an industry now casually spending 9 figures on things you watch for free with a subscription. But to understand how we got to that number, we have to go back to a time when TV wasn't just cheaper than movies. It was considered a completely different, lesser art form entirely, when television was the broke cousin of Hollywood. For most of the 20th century, there was an unspoken hierarchy in entertainment. Movies were where real budgets, real prestige, and real ambition lived. Television was where you put a camera in front of a couch, hired a handful of actors, and shot an episode in days, because the entire business model depended on churning out dozens of episodes a year as cheaply as possible. A live studio audience, a handful of standing sets, minimal location shooting that was the economics of network television for decades, and it worked precisely because nobody expected TV to look or feel like cinema. That began to crack in the early 2000s. And one show is usually credited as the turning point that made the entire industry realize television could spend like a movie and still make sense financially. In 2001, HBO, Tom Hanks, and Steven Spielberg released Band of Brothers, a 10-episode World War II miniseries that reportedly cost $125 million total, around $12.5 million per episode. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $23 million per episode in today's money. At the time, spending that kind of money on television was almost unheard of. Elaborate European filming locations, meticulous period sets, a genuinely cinematic scale of battle sequences, none of it looked like anything television had produced before. It won a stack of Emmys and Golden Globes, and more importantly, it proved something the entire industry quietly took note of. Audiences would treat a television show with movie-level polish as a genuine cultural event, not just background noise. It's worth pointing out just how radical that idea actually was at the time. For decades, the entire economic logic of television had been built around volume. Not spectacle, a hit network drama, or comedy needed to produce 20-plus episodes a year, cheaply enough that even modest ratings could turn a profit through advertising and eventual syndication. Band of Brothers flipped that logic on its head. It was a limited, 10-episode story with no long-term syndication engine behind it, financed almost entirely on the strength of prestige and reputation. HBO was betting that subscribers would pay a monthly fee specifically for the kind of ambitious, expensive storytelling broadcast networks couldn't justify. And that bet became the entire foundation of what prestige television would mean for the next 2 decades. Here's the detail that makes this such a pivotal moment. Though Band of Brothers wasn't actually the most expensive show of its era on a pure per-episode basis. That distinction, strangely, belonged to a sitcom. The sitcom that broke the budget ceiling. By its final seasons, Friends was costing NBC around $10 million per episode, an almost absurd figure for a half-hour comedy, shot largely on a handful of recurring apartment and coffee shop sets. The reason wasn't lavish production value, it was the cast. By the end of the show's run, each of the 6 leads was reportedly earning about $1 million per episode, a negotiating tactic that came from the actors banding together and refusing to let the network pit them against each other in separate contract talks. That's worth pausing on, because it reveals something that stays true across almost every entry on this list. The most expensive television isn't necessarily the most visually ambitious. Sometimes the number is inflated by sets and visual effects. Sometimes it's inflated entirely by what it costs to keep the right faces on screen. Both strategies, it turns out, can produce 9-figure seasons, but only one of those 2 strategies was about to get supercharged by a technology shift nobody saw coming. Then streaming happened, and the rules changed completely. Here's the question worth sitting with before we go further. Why would a streaming platform with no advertisers, no live ratings pressure, and no network affiliates to please ever need to spend more money per episode than a broadcast network did? The answer turns out to be almost the opposite of what you'd assume. Streaming didn't reduce the pressure to spend big. It multiplied it. Traditional networks built an audience slowly, over years, one weekly episode at a time, with a built-in safety net. Even a modest show could survive, for seasons on so-so ratings, as long as it kept a loyal audience coming back. Streaming platforms don't get that luxury. A new series usually gets one shot, a single release, often dropped all at once to convince a global subscriber base, spanning dozens of countries and cultures, that it's worth their time immediately. There's no slow build. There's no room to grow into the story. Which means every new flagship series effectively needs to look and feel like an event right out of the gate, because the platform is betting an entire marketing push, and often a chunk of its subscriber growth strategy, on that first impression landing perfectly. That single structural pressure is most of the reason television budgets exploded over the following decade. And nowhere is that explosion more visible than in the show that, for years, defined what a big-budget television series even meant: Game of Thrones and the slow climb to $15 million an episode. When Game of Thrones premiered in 2011, its per-episode budget was around $6 million, expensive for the era, but nowhere near unprecedented. Here's the part that tells you everything about how this genre of television actually grows, though. That number didn't stay put. As the show's popularity snowballed into a genuine global phenomenon, HBO kept pouring more money into it season after season, chasing bigger battles, bigger dragons, and bigger sets. By its 8th and final season in 2019, the per-episode budget had climbed to roughly $15 million, over $18 million in today's money, meaning the cost of producing a single hour of the show had more than doubled since its debut. That pattern, a show starting modestly and then scaling its budget dramatically once it proves it has an audience, became the template almost every major streaming platform would eventually try to replicate. Except the next generation of shows skipped the slow climb entirely and simply started at the number Game of Thrones took 8 years to reach. The Marvel effect and a 5-way tie for second place. When Disney Plus launched, it needed to prove immediately that streaming Marvel content could feel every bit as cinematic as Marvel's theatrical releases, because if it didn't, the entire value proposition of the platform was in question. So Disney simply applied movie-level budgets directly to television. WandaVision, Loki, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Hawkeye, and other early Marvel Disney Plus series all reportedly landed at roughly the same number, around $25 million per episode. For a while, that figure, a 5-way tie between shows built on the same interconnected universe, represented the highest tier of television spending outside of one very specific genre, fantasy epics, trying to outscale Game of Thrones itself. Because right around the same time, several fantasy and sci-fi productions were quietly approaching, then surpassing, that $25 million mark. The Wheel of Time landed around $16 million per episode. HBO's own Game of Thrones successor, House of the Dragon, reportedly kept its budget just under $20 million per episode deliberately, according to reporting at the time, as an effort to prove the franchise could scale back slightly without losing its scope. Apple's The Morning Show hit roughly $15 million per episode, remarkable for a series with essentially no visual effects or fantasy elements at all, driven almost entirely by a cast that included Jennifer Aniston and Reese Witherspoon. The Last of Us reportedly crossed $15 million per episode too, in an entirely different genre built around a global pandemic and practical creature effects rather than capes or dragons. And then, in 2022, one single show didn't just top that list, it obliterated it. But right before we get to that record, there's one more show worth pausing on, because it demonstrates a completely different reason budgets climb: not fantasy world building, not a beloved literary franchise, but simple, escalating ambition from a creative team given a blank check. Netflix's Stranger Things started as a relatively modest, nostalgia-soaked horror series. By its 4th season in 2022, that modesty was long gone. The 9 episodes reportedly cost about $270 million combined, or roughly $30 million per episode, briefly making it the most expensive show on the platform's own roster. Some individual episodes in that season ran close to 2 hours long, effectively functioning as feature films with television budgets to match. It's a useful reminder that these numbers don't only climb because a studio is chasing a specific competitor's franchise. Sometimes they climb simply because a show that started small became too big and too beloved for anyone to say no to its ambitions. The Record Holder. A show that cost more per episode than most movies. Cost to make entirely. Here's a number worth reading twice. Amazon's The Lord of the Rings. The Rings of Power reportedly cost around $58 million per episode for its first season, nearly 10 times what Game of Thrones spent at its own peak. The season's total budget has been reported anywhere from $465 million to over $700 million, and a huge chunk of that wasn't even about cameras or actors at all. Roughly $250 million of it reportedly went simply toward licensing the rights to use J.R.R. Tolkien's appendices, the raw material for the story itself, before a single frame had been filmed. Stop and consider what that actually means. $250 million spent purely on the legal right to tell a story is roughly double what it cost to make the entire Band of Brothers miniseries that shocked the industry just 2 decades earlier. And that's before accounting for the sprawling New Zealand sets, the visual effects required to build an entire fictional age of Middle-earth from scratch, and a score from composer Bear McCreary layered over all of it. Here's the twist that makes this story genuinely uncomfortable for the entire industry though, and it's rarely mentioned in the same breath as the budget figures. Spending record-shattering amounts of money doesn't actually guarantee anything. The Rings of Power drew a massive 25 million viewers globally for its premiere, but audience data afterwards suggested it struggled to hold on to viewers outside the existing Tolkien fanbase, and reception among critics and longtime fans was sharply divided. Some industry analysts have gone as far as arguing that the show's astronomical budget didn't just fail to guarantee its success. It may have actively distorted the creative decisions behind it, pressuring the series toward broad, safe choices designed to justify the spending rather than take the kind of narrative risks that made Game of Thrones a phenomenon in the first place. That raises a genuinely uncomfortable question worth sitting with. Is there a point where a television budget becomes so enormous that it actually works against the show rather than for it? We're about to find out, because the record Rings of Power set in 2022 may not hold for much longer. The number that might break the record completely. Reports on HBO's upcoming live-action Harry Potter series set to premiere its first season this Christmas, adapting Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone over 8 episodes, have varied wildly, which itself tells you something about how secretive studios have become about these figures. Some outlets have put the show's per-episode cost around $57 million, roughly in line with Rings of Power. Others have reported a far more staggering figure, around $100 million per episode, which would make a single hour of this show more expensive than the average entire Harry Potter film. For context, the 8 original Harry Potter movies combined cost about $1.2 billion to produce. If the higher figure is accurate, and if the reported plan to adapt all 7 books across 7 seasons of 8 episodes each actually holds, the total cost of the television series alone could approach $5.6 billion, nearly 5 times what it cost to make all 8 films, and close to 3/4 of what the entire film franchise has earned at the worldwide box office across 25 years. Warner Bros. Is reportedly building a permanent, dedicated production facility in the UK for the show, described in some reports as something close to a small city complete with an on-site school for its child actors. At a price tag alone of roughly $1.3 billion, composer Hans Zimmer is scoring it. Over 30,000 children reportedly auditioned for just 3 roles. Here's the part worth remembering. As you watch this show premiere, whenever you eventually do, nobody outside the studio actually knows, with certainty, which of those reported numbers is real, or whether the final figure will land somewhere else entirely once all 8 episodes of the first season are finished and the accountants tally the true cost. What we do know is this: if either widely reported figure holds, Harry Potter won't just be an expensive television show. It will likely be remembered as the moment the ceiling on what a single episode of television can cost got knocked off entirely, following a straight, unbroken line stretching back through Rings of Power, through the Marvel Disney Plus shows, through Game of Thrones, all the way back to a World War II miniseries that once seemed unthinkably extravagant at $12 million an episode. There's a wider bet buried underneath all of that spending too, and it has almost nothing to do with Harry Potter specifically. Warner Brothers Discovery has reportedly been the target of major acquisition interest, with one reported deal valuing the company north of $100 billion And Harry Potter, alongside franchises like Game of Thrones and the DC Universe, has been described as one of the single most valuable assets sitting inside that entire company. Betting billions on one television series, in other words, isn't really a decision being made in isolation. It's a decision being made by a studio trying to prove to investors and potential buyers alike that its most iconic franchise can still generate the kind of sustained, decade-long subscriber loyalty that a 2-hour movie simply can't. Which leaves one last question worth asking, because it's the one nobody in the industry seems to have a confident answer to yet. Every one of these budget records was set on a bet that spending more would translate directly into more subscribers, more cultural relevance, more staying power. Some of those bets, like Game of Thrones, paid off spectacularly. Others, like Rings of Power, produced results the industry itself still seems divided on. So as these numbers keep climbing higher, past 50 million, past 100 million, into territory no one would have believed a decade ago, is the entertainment industry actually learning what audiences want? Or is it simply making the same bet, over and over, at a bigger and bigger table, hoping that this time, the math finally works out?